All right, welcome to part 6. This is the last numbered part of this series. So basically, this is kind of the last piece of really knowing and me explaining, kind of talking through the guts, the internal workings of approvals, because we're really just looking now at what the data is coming out of the approval. So that approval gets created, gets assigned, the approvers or approver acts on it, and then it completes. What happens next? So what can we do with the information that we get back out of that approval action? That's what we're going to be talking about here today. All right, so first things first, let's just do a quick review of completion conditions. And again, this is just to, it's been a while since maybe you've just watched that video, so that you don't need the review. You can skip ahead a couple of minutes, but I did want to make sure that we're covering this, just so we know what we're talking about next. So you kind of have this single approval scenario, regardless of whether you select everyone must approve or first to respond. If it's just if that approval is assigned to a single person, then it's going to complete. It's going to be done once that person has made a choice. So if it's assigned to one person and they approve it, then it's approved. If they reject it, it's rejected. End of story. Can't be reopened. That's it. Now, when you have multiple approvers, the approval type that you select has some bearing. So it is important to understand the difference. When you have multiple approvers, so this means that in the assigned to field, you're specifying either you're hard coding multiple people or you're passing it a variable or some semicolon separated string of user emails or UPNs. Then you have multiple approvers, and therefore the type makes a difference. So if you select everyone must approve, then it's that approval will complete whenever the first person says reject, because once someone says reject, then everyone hasn't approved because one of those people rejected it. So if the first, say you've got 5 approvers and the first person that gets it says no, it's rejected. The other 4 people may not have even seen the email yet, may not even know that the request came in. So it's important to understand that that is the consequence, that once that one person says reject, it's done. Or if, assuming that the responders, the approvers, do not select reject, it will continue on until all of them have selected approve. That's the point of everyone must approve. I don't want to belabor the point, but that's it. Now, if you select the other choice of first to respond, it basically means whoever gets there first wins. So if it's sent to those same 5 approvers and it's set to first to respond, then whoever answers first, whatever their response is, that's it. That's, if the first person gets it and rejects it, then it's done. It's been rejected. And that's kind of important to understand, because in a lot of cases, especially cases where you're having multiple people, multiple approvers involved, that can be confusing to people who haven't used Power Automate approvals, because they're coming from a place where they think they're thinking of this as a question that's being posed to that group of people as if they were sitting in a room, where you're saying to all 5, hey, this is the choice, who approves, who rejects. And if in that scenario to tell them that the first person who makes a choice, that's it, that's done, that's kind of insane. That's not how most businesses work. So you do need to make sure that you know what you're doing when you choose that approval type. And understand the consequences of that choice. Anyway, moving on. These are going to come back in because they also play a role in what data we get out of the approvals. But to just talk through kind of the output of the approval action, once the approval is completed, basically there are a number of things. This is not all of the fields. This is just the most important ones to be aware of, or all of the data. First off, there is an array of responses. Again, because an approval can be assigned to multiple people, that responses is section is always going to be an array, even if it's an array of just one item. And that's important to understand the formatting, because when you might say, well, I'm only assigning it to one person, I just want to get the comments. Why is it throwing that into an apply to each? It's because it expects that to be an array, or it knows that that data is an array, so it needs to iterate over each item in that array, even if there's only one item. So just be aware of that. There is a response summary, which is a string. This is kind of useful in some respects, because it's pretty much Microsoft trying to be helpful. It's a, as the name implies, a summary of each response. So it's going to include the name of the responder, what the response was, and the date that they responded. The one piece that it doesn't include, in my mind, if it included the comments, this would be like the perfect thing, but it doesn't. And in almost every single scenario, every single approval process I build for someone, they want those comments. So you need to kind of think about how to get those out of that responses array, and we're going to talk about that toward the end here. But basically, the response summary is just a summary, and it's good for sort of if you're going to build a logging system, like I showed in a previous video, making that audit trail, that audit log list. Throwing that response summary into a field in that list is a great way to just say, hey, here's the choices that were made, by whom, and who made the choice, what choice did they make, and when did they make it. If you also need to include the comments, again, you need to do a little extra work. And then there's an outcome field, which is also a string value. Now, this is what's actually in that string is going to be a comma separated concatenation of all the responses received. So again, you need to think, how many responses could there be? If it's sent to 5 people and it's everyone must respond, and let's say all 5 approved, then that outcome is going to be approve, comma, approve, comma, approve, comma, etc. It'll have 5 approves separated by commas. But if let's say the second person that gets it, second person to take an action rejects it, then what you're going to see is reject, because it'll be whatever response was received last, the most recent response to the oldest response. So it'll say reject, comma, approve. And just to show you an example of this, I'm going to jump over to my Power Automate flow here. So we have this one approval, multiple approvers. Just to give you a quick example of what I'm talking about, in here we have this everyone must approve, and in this case everyone did approve, so we have Peter who approved, and then Chad who also approved. So if I look at the outputs of that, there's our responses. Actually, that's not what I want. So we've got our responses. Actually, let me just click the show raw outputs. It's a little easier to read here. So here we've got the responses array, so the 2 responses in the array. Then we have that response summary, which is just going to be approver, blah, blah, blah. Great. And the /ands are line breaks, so this would be kind of formatted to look neatly in a, as a text field. So if you're putting it into like a multi-line of text field in SharePoint, it'll look fine. But we can see the outcome is approve, comma, approve, because both people approved. Again, if Chad had rejected, I'm sorry, yeah, so Peter responded first, so that's this response. Again, these are reverse order, so Peter responded first, there's approve, and then Chad responded second with reject, then it's going to be rejected. All right, so that's kind of the response body, and just want to be sure we understood that, and that outcome field. Now, how do we now that outcome? A lot of people, when they want to figure out what to do after the end, after the the approval is complete, they need to think about what's going to happen next. And let's talk a little theory first. So this is the part of the conversation that always ends up getting derailed when I talk to people who want an approval flow, because they'll say, we want this approval, and someone's going to request this, and it needs to go to all these people, and if they all approve it, then it gets approved. But that it's not that simple. It's not that clean in every case, because invariably they'll say, well, we want people to say, we want to let people talk about it, and we wanted them to see. In one case, I had someone who wanted each approver. They've got 5 approvers, and they want each one to see the other people's response before they make their own response, and just getting them to understand that, well, there's no data, so they can't see the other people's responses until they've made a choice. And at that point, did they want to be able to go back and change their choice? It got really messy. Bottom line, talk to whoever's asking for this and make sure you really, really have a solid grasp on what it is they want to happen after that approval completes. So do they really want a single person rejecting it to make the whole thing rejected? Do they really want the first person to make a choice? They want that first to respond scenario where whoever gets to it first, their decision is the law. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but you need to make sure that they understand what those mean so that you can build this appropriately. And I understand it can be tough to talk to people about this, but it starts with you having an understanding of how these choices work and what choices you have, and how they are going to impact the overall process of your flow. But think about what needs to happen when that approval completion occurs. Do you want to send an email? Do you want to update a list item? Do you want to update the document properties if it's an approval for a policy or a contract? Do you want something else to happen? Do you want to, maybe it's a project approval, and part of that is generating a new team for that project to be, for the people who are going to be working on that project. So think about what's going to happen when that approval is done. More importantly, when it's approved, because there are likely going to be other processes that need to happen. But also, if it's rejected, do you want to give them the ability to appeal that? Like, maybe if I submit this request for reimbursement and it gets rejected because I'm asking for too much, can I resubmit it, or can I edit it and request approval again for a lesser amount, or remove some things that shouldn't have been in there to begin with? So think about that. Who's going to be notified? How? Where? Is it going to be an email? Is it going to be a Teams message? Is there another stage of the approval? So if it goes through preliminary, is there sort of a preliminary approval and then a second stage approval? Maybe you have the manager approve the purchase or reimbursement, but then it needs to go to finance to get final approval from the financial people to say, yes, we can give them that money back. So again, just all things you need to think about. It's rarely an open and shut case, and these are questions that are kind of important if even in a single approver scenario, but significantly more important when you're talking about multiple approvers, because anytime you've got multiple people, you've got multiple opinions on how it's supposed to work or how they expect it to work. So just be sure that you factor all that in when you're talking to whoever's asking for this approval process, or if you're just thinking through and planning it yourself. You almost can't overthink this. So anyway, in terms of the practical side of evaluating the outcomes of this, basically in almost every Microsoft template involving an approval, they use a condition, because they're using the standard approve and reject choices. So if it's approve, if outcome is equal to approve, then do this. If not, do that. And with approve and reject, it can only be one of those two things. So it's approved, then do that. If it's not approved, then do the other thing. That being said, you don't need to use a condition. You can use a switch, and this switch is especially useful if you're using custom choices and there are more than two. For example, I built one review, sort of a document review flow where the choices are, approve, reject, or hold. So basically, I can't use a simple condition to say, is it approve or reject, because there's a third possibility. I mean, I could, but in that case, it's not truly evaluating the data because it's just looking for that one value. Whereas if you use a switch in that case, then you kind of define a different pathway based on what that value is. So the switch would be, the switch would look at the outcome, and if the outcome is approved, then do this. If it's reject, do this. If it's hold, then do this other thing. So basically a switch is just, think of it as a condition with more than one pathway coming out of it, or more than one possible, or more than two choice values, or something like that. Now, we're going to kind of take a step back to that outcome string field. If you were using a single approver scenario, so just one person is approving, or you go with the first to respond method or approval type, then all you need to do is look at that outcome string and say, is that equal to approve, or the affirmative if you're using custom choices. If it is, then you're done. Now, the problem is when you have multiple approvers and you select everyone must approve, if the first person rejects it, then that outcome will just say reject. But if the first person approves it, or let's say it's five approvers and the first three approve it, the number 4 selects reject, then that outcome field is going to be reject, comma, approve, comma, approve, comma, approve. So you can't simply say, does outcome equal reject, or is outcome equal to reject? What I typically use is, I would say, is if outcome contains reject, then you know that it's not, that at least one person rejected it. Or you could say, does it not contain approve? Again, it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Depends what logic, which way you prefer to do your logic, kind of forward logic or reverse logic and double negative logic. It can get kind of crazy, but the important thing is to just understand that you want to look for that outcome string either containing the word reject or not containing the word approve. But even then it can get messy. Bottom line, it can be messy. Think things through. I'm not going to be able to cover every possible scenario here, so kind of relying on you to do your due diligence and understand what you're doing here. All right. So now the fun part, comments. How do we get those comments? Because they're not in that responses summary. I wish they were. It would make my life a lot easier in many cases. And again, the response, the comments are in a single approver scenario, pretty simple. Not simple, but not terrible. Because basically, if there's only one response, so again, a single approver, or multiple approvers but first to respond, then basically that is going to be, that responses array is only going to have one item in it. And if you, let's say, use a compose action to get those comments, then it's going to throw that into an apply to each loop. So just to show you an example of that, in here, in my compose, I simply said, actually let me edit this so you can see what the edit field looks like. So basically you can see this apply to each is operating on the responses array, so body / responses, and then I'm composing the comments. So when I created the compose and I select the response as comments, it automatically throws it into this apply to each because it's an array. It has to do that. Now, in this case, the problem is when you have a compose inside of an apply to each like this, it's more complicated to get this data output. So if I were to go elsewhere down here, maybe I want to add an email action. So in my email, I want to send an email notification, and then in here I want to include those comments, and I search for output because the output of every compose action is simply outputs. So if I search for outputs, I don't see the outputs of that compose that's inside of the apply to each loop because it's an array. It can be multiple values, so it can be messy. Again, I'm not going to go into all the details, but just let you know it can be messy. What you might want to do is, instead of using the compose and apply to each, is basically to sidestep that, use the same technique you would use for the multi-approver scenario, which is use select. Now, when you have the select action in Power Automate is one of those that is, I think, criminally underused, but what it allows you to do is take an array of data, such as the responses array, and extract specific values from it to build a new array. Excuse me. So in this case, I'm taking the responses data, and I'm saying, give me the responder display name, give me the responder response, or approver response as they call it, give me their comments, and then give me the timestamp, so the date that they responded. So I just want that information. What am I going to do with that information? Well, I can then take this response, or the output of this select responses values, and build an HTML table. And then I can basically throw that HTML table into an email or a text field or anywhere else you can throw that HTML, you can throw that HTML. So if we take a look at kind of the run history of this flow the last time it ran, we can see that in our responses values, there's our first responder, there's our second responder, and here is the output. So this is all the stuff that it's getting, and then the output is simply responder, response, comment, timestamp. And if we then take that into the HTML table, it's taking that input, converting it into an HTML table that looks pretty cool. I mean, you could simply drop this into an email and be done. Say, okay, this is the outcome of that response. So just throw that in an email to the responder and say, this person approved it, saying sure thing. This person approved it, saying this thing at this date and time. Now, you might want to use a conversion here because these dates and times are UTC. Convert them to the the requester or whoever you're sending this to. Convert them to their local time just for friendliness. And maybe format it in whatever string type they want. So maybe time then date, date then time. It's up to you. Bottom line is you can do that in the select action by wrapping that timestamp in a convert function or expression, rather, not function, expression. So there you go. So that's basically what I typically do for compiling the outcome of a multi-approver as I build this kind of table. Now, in some cases, you might want to write these values to another list or a library or something like that, and you can do that. Basically, once you get that into this responses values array, you can iterate through this array and say, create a new row or new entries in maybe you have a separate list of approval responses and you want to have columns there for the responder, their response, the comment, and the time. You can throw those entries in there or use these as part of that, that log list that you're building, the audit trail. All right, so that is kind of the gist of getting at the comments. And there are some other tricks to this. There are a bunch of other people. Reza Durrani has some fantastic videos on how to sort of pull out those comments and format that very nicely. So I do recommend he's much better at this than I am, so I will defer to him and say that take a look at his videos on creating better comments, and you'll probably learn a lot more than I can show you here today. So that is the comments. And what's next? So basically now we've kind of gone through all the nitty-gritty, the bits and pieces that make up approvals. So we talked about the kinds of approvals and how we assign them and how we know that they're done, and we talked about logging that data. So it is important to, because the flow run history is not going to stick around forever, and the work the approval history is not going to be there forever, you'll probably want to have a more permanent record. So creating a log list and audit trail for those approval actions is really kind of important in a lot of scenarios. So we've talked about all those different things. There are a lot of other videos. I'm kind of done going, as I said, I'm done talking about the guts of approvals. And there are a lot of others out there on kind of the standard approval scenarios, like a vacation or leave request that goes to a manager, and there are templates that can do that. So I don't want to retread a lot of ground that's already been tread. So I'm going to probably build a playlist of some of the better ones that I found for those. There aren't a lot of videos on more complicated cases, things like how do people go about, how do you build an approval process where people can appeal it? So if it's rejected, then give them a way to resubmit it for approval. So modify the thing and then reapprove it, or basically reevaluate it for approval. Or tallying votes. So if if you're making a hiring decision, you want to send this, you want to use approvals as a consolidated, coordinated way to send a, to get all of the people who have a say to vote on which candidate to hire, or should we hire this candidate, yes or no. So I'm going to kind of work through and build out a couple of flows on those particular topics. So the appeal and also tallying votes, because I think that's something a lot of people need to do. They just aren't sure where to start. So I've done a couple of those, but I'm eager to learn more myself about how to do it efficiently. So hopefully you will check out those videos later on as I post them. Might be a couple of days, getting kind of into the busy time of year for me, so it might take me a while to get more videos out, but hopefully they'll be there in the next couple of weeks. Thank you, and if you have any questions, comments, throw them in the comments section below, or if you have any specific approval type scenarios or situations where you want to know if approvals are going to be helpful, throw those in the comments as well, and that may give me a better idea of what it is you want to learn about. So thank you. I appreciate a like, and if you want to subscribe, that would be fantastic and help other people find this channel. Great, and thank you, and have an awesome day.